I counted the barrel 3 times before I let myself believe it. Full to the rim. 60-some years since anybody lit a fire under that copper. And the mash was sitting there full to the rim, warm as a held hand. That's how Ruth Calloway's night started. The one she wrote down in her field notebook and then, near as anybody can tell, never spoke of again outside of one phone call to a cousin she hadn't talked to in 11 years. Settle in, if you're the kind who likes the quiet ones. Pull the blankets up. Let the porch light in your mind burn low and steady. Because tonight we're going down into Tanglefoot Branch, and we're going down slow. Ruth wasn't there for family business. She'd tell you that herself if you asked. She was there for a land use report, plain and simple. Environmental site assessor. 11 years with the state. Sent out to walk a hollow property ahead of a conservation easement filing. Somebody in Raleigh wanted the paperwork clean before the county could fold that acreage into a protected corridor. Wetland delineation, soil samples, photograph the drainage, note the tree cover, flag anything that might slow down a bulldozer later. That was the whole job. Ruth Calloway had done 40 of these before Tanglefoot Branch, and every single one of them had been boring, in the good way, the way that pays the mortgage and doesn't follow you home. Tanglefoot Branch doesn't show up on most road maps. You have to know it by the creek that shares its name, a thin thread of cold water coming down off the ridge through a stand of hemlock so old and so tight-packed the daylight gets drained down to almost nothing by the time it reaches the ground. Ruth parked her state truck at the edge of a logging road that hadn't seen a logging truck in decades, grass grown up tall between the ruts, and walked the rest of the way in on foot, boots sinking soft into ground that never quite dried out, not even in August. That's the kind of hollow it is. The kind where the air feels a few degrees colder than it has any right to be. Where the bird song seems to thin out the further in you walk, until by the time you reach the old home place, there's nothing left but the sound of your own breathing and water moving somewhere close by, patient, unbothered, going about its business the same way it's gone about it for 10,000 years. The property belonged, on paper, to a Calloway. Her Calloway. Her great-great-uncle's name was still on a deed nobody had touched since 1958. A hollow of maybe 60 acres, running up along a spring branch that fed into the Yadkin, thick with rhododendron and second-growth poplar and one collapsed springhouse sitting crooked in a fold of the land where the light never quite made it all the way to the ground. Ruth's own grandmother had grown up 2 hollows over and had never, not once in Ruth's whole life, said a single word about a great-uncle in Tanglefoot Branch. Ruth hadn't thought that was strange until she was standing in the wreck of that springhouse with her flashlight beam catching copper. The still was old. Prohibition old by the look of the rivets and the hand-hammered seams. Somebody had built it to last, and then somebody had hidden it well, tucked back under a fall of collapsed fieldstone at the rear of the springhouse where you'd never find it, unless you were crawling on your hands and knees taking soil cores, which Ruth was. She found the pot first, then the worm coil, still coiled tight, not so much as a kink in 60 years. Then, behind a slab of stone that took both her hands and her whole body weight to shift, she found the mash barrel. It should have been dry rot, splinters and dust and the smell of nothing at all. Instead, the wood was swollen tight with moisture, dark and slick. And when Ruth laid her palm flat against the staves out of pure reflex, the same reflex you'd use to check if a stove was hot, the wood was warm. Not sun-warm. Not held warm from her own hand a second before. Warm on its own, low and steady, like something breathing slow behind a wall. She told herself corn mash left long enough will keep working on wild yeast alone, given the right conditions, given enough time and enough warmth from decomposition. And there was some truth buried in that guess, the kind of half-truth a person tells themselves so they can put their tools away and go on back to the truck. That's what Ruth Calloway did. She logged the coordinates. She noted abandoned distillery apparatus, historic, non-hazardous, in her file, because that was the honest professional description, and because there wasn't a box on the form for anything else. And she drove the 40 minutes back to the motel in Sparta, telling herself she'd finish the soil work in the morning and be home by Friday. She was not home by Friday. She wasn't home for 11 more days. And by the third of those nights, she'd stopped sleeping at the motel at all, because something about that hollow had gotten into her the way a splinter works its way in under a nail, small and constant, impossible to leave alone. Now, before we go any further down into Tanglefoot Branch, I want to sit with you a minute, the way I always do. My name is Silas Vance. Folks who've been with me a while just call me Abe. And if this is your first night finding your way into these hollows, well, pull that blanket a little higher and get comfortable, because you picked a good one to start on. And to the ones who've been riding along with me a while now, the ones who ride in and tell me they've got this playing low through a set of old earbuds propped on a nightstand 3 states from where I'm sitting, or running through a truck radio on a night shift somewhere the interstate goes dark past midnight. I see you. I'm glad you're here. Now hush up and let me tell you what Ruth Calloway found in that hollow. Because it isn't done with her yet, and I don't believe it's near done at all. Ruth went back to the springhouse the next evening, and the evening after that, telling her supervisor she needed more time on the wetland delineation, which wasn't entirely a lie. What she didn't put in any report was the level of the mash, because on that second night, Kneeling there with her headlamp angled down into the barrel, she could see it plain. The level had dropped. Not evaporated down, not the slow inch a barrel loses over a hot afternoon. Dropped clean, the way water drops in a glass somebody's been drinking from. A good 4 inches gone from where she'd marked it with a strip of brew survey tape the night before. She told herself raccoons. She told herself deer thirsty enough to find a way in through some gap in the stone she hadn't spotted. She stood there a long while in the dark, turning those excuses over, and none of them held the weight of her own 2 eyes, because there wasn't a track anywhere in the soft dirt around that barrel. Not one. Just her own boot prints, coming and going. It was the 3rd night she heard the humming. Low, slow. Not quite a tune you could follow, but close enough to one that some old buried part of Ruth's mind kept reaching for it, kept trying to place where she'd heard it before. It came from inside the springhouse walls, or from the barrel itself, or maybe both at once, the way a sound in a cave seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. She stood outside in the dark, holding her breath, and the humming didn't stop when she moved. It didn't stop when she cleared her throat, loud, on purpose, the way you'd announce yourself to a stranger in the woods. It just kept on, patient, unhurried, like something rocking gentle in a chair that never needed to get up. She went home to her grandmother's things after that. Not home to Sparta, home, 4 hours south, to the little brick house where her grandmother had lived out her last years before the nursing home, where a niece was keeping the place until the family decided what to do with it. Ruth dug through a cedar chest in the spare room until 2 in the morning, and near the bottom, under a stack of quilt squares nobody had ever finished sewing, she found a ledger, water-stained, half the pages gone soft and stuck together beyond reading. But on one page, in handwriting she recognized as her own grandmother's before the arthritis got bad, there was a short list of instructions. No explanation, no context, just rules. The way you'd write down something you never wanted to forget and never wanted to have to explain twice. Keep her full, it said. Never let her see bottom. Fill by handful, not the pump. Rain only. Never well water. Never creek. And under that, in older, shakier handwriting that wasn't her grandmother's at all, one line, underlined twice. She only asks for what's owed. Don't give her more. Ruth didn't understand any of it. Not really. Not the way you'd understand instructions for changing a tire or setting a trap. But she understood enough to feel the cold settle into her chest reading it at 2 in the morning in a house that smelled like a grandmother's hand lotion. And she understood enough to drive straight back to Tanglefoot Branch the next afternoon instead of finishing the soil survey she was actually being paid to do. The barrel had dropped another 2 inches by the time she got there. She stood over it a long time before she made her decision. The way you stand at the edge of a pool trying to talk yourself into cold water. Then she went out to her truck, filled an old gallon jug from the spring branch running along the property line. Clear and cold and close. So much closer than driving 40 minutes back to town for anything. And she carried it back into the springhouse and poured it into the barrel. The humming stopped. It didn't fade out slow, the way a sound does when whatever's making it moves off through the trees. It cut off, sudden and total, mid-note, like a hand had come down flat over a mouth. And in that silence, thick enough to press against her eardrums, Ruth understood, too late, exactly which line in that ledger she'd just broken. Creek water, not rain. She'd used creek water because it was there, because it was easy, because some tired, practical part of her mind had decided the rules of a dead woman's ledger didn't really apply to measurements in volume the way real chemistry did. The level in the barrel didn't rise from what she'd poured in. It should have. Physics said it should have, plain and simple. Liquid added to liquid. Instead, it kept dropping, faster now. A dark surface pulling away from the rim like something underneath was drinking twice as hard to make up for the insult of being fed the wrong thing. Ruth backed out of that spring house into a night gone perfectly, unnaturally still. No crickets. No wind moving the rhododendron. Just her own breath, loud in her ears. And somewhere behind her, soft against the stone, the faintest sound of something shifting its weight. She didn't go back to the motel that night. She sat in her truck at the mouth of the hollow with the doors locked and the engine running for heat. And somewhere around 4 a.m, worn down past fear into something closer to resignation, she understood a second thing the ledger hadn't spelled out plain, but that she felt in her chest, the way you feel a debt you didn't know you owed until the collector's already standing on your porch. This wasn't hers to walk away from. It had been the family's a long time before it was ever the state's business. Long before any easement or survey crew. And somebody in that family line had been keeping that barrel full, quiet and faithful, one handful of rainwater at a time, for longer than anybody currently living had been alive to ask why. Her great-great-uncle hadn't run whiskey out of that hollow at all. Not really. Not as the main business of it. He'd kept something fed, so it wouldn't have to go looking for its own supper elsewhere in the hollow, where there were houses and porches and people who slept with their windows cracked for the summer air. The mash was never really about proof or profit. It was about keeping something busy in the dark, so the dark stayed where it belonged. And Ruth Calloway had come along 70 years later with a clipboard and a soil auger, meaning to hand this whole hollow over to the state as protected, untouched land. And in doing that, she'd walked right up to something old and hungry and told it, without meaning a word of it, that the feeding was about to stop for good. Because a conservation easement doesn't come with a keeper. It just comes with a fence line and a sign nobody reads twice. She finished the report anyway, filed it clean, on time, exactly the way her supervisor expected. But before she turned it in, she drove back out to Tanglefoot Branch one more time, at dusk, with a gallon jug of rainwater she'd collected off her own roof in Sparta. Because rain was rain, no matter where it fell, she reasoned, and that had to count for something. She's still going back. Every week or two, whenever the weather allows it, whenever she can find a reason to be in that part of the state that doesn't sound like what it actually is. She fills the barrel by the handful, the way the ledger said, careful never to let it see bottom, careful never to use anything but rain. The hummings come back, low and slow and almost gentle now, the way you'd hum to something that trusts you. The easement went through, by the way. Tanglefoot Branch is protected land now, officially, on paper, forever, according to the state of North Carolina. Nobody's supposed to build there. Nobody's supposed to clear it or drain it or touch that collapsed springhouse at all. Which means nobody's supposed to be back there filling a copper mash barrel every other week either. Except that somebody has to. Ruth figures that's just hers now, the way the ledger was her grandmother's, and her grandmother's mother's before that, going back further than anybody bothered writing down. She told her cousin, the one phone call she made about any of this, that she doesn't mind it. Not really. Says it's a quiet kind of job. Says the hollow's peaceful this time of evening, once the humming settles in low and even, and the light's gone soft behind the ridge. She just asked her cousin one thing at the end of that call, and it's the one thing Ruth still can't answer herself. What happens the year she can't make the drive? Who's supposed to know to go in her place? Nobody's answered that yet. And Tanglefoot Branch, so far as anybody official knows, is just 60 quiet acres of protected wetland, exactly as clean and empty as Ruth Calloway wrote it up to be. I'll let you sit with that one a while before you drift off. If you're new to this hollow, go on and hit that subscribe button so you don't wander into these woods again without a light to guide you. Otherwise, just close your eyes and let the sound of the branch running easy carry you the rest of the way down. This has been Silas Vance, and you've been listening with Abe, same as always, out here in the Redacted Archives. Rest easy tonight, and if you ever find a barrel sitting warm where it's got no business being warm at all, do yourself a kindness. Don't ask what it's for. Just top it off, quiet, and go on home.